Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and we are very glad to have you with us today at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we will be here another hour from 2 to 3, and you can pick us up at your leisure on YouTube, and also we air again on WFOV 92.1. I'm going to be talking today about two different topics. I need to talk about the second one in particular, since we are now in the throes of the seemingly impeachment that's going to be brought to bear upon the country. I don't think they're going to stop in terms of what they're trying to do with impugning the integrity of this president. They are determined, I'm talking about the Democrats, are determined, it seems, to overturn the will of the people, the verdict of which was rendered on November the 8th, 2016, where we went to the polls. We weren't gathered there by the Russians, went to the polls, and we voted in an outsider. And the insiders have tried to push the narrative that the Russians caused us to go to the polls and vote against our will, apparently, and put Donald Trump into the White House. Nobody talks about the fact that he was also willed by the Republican Party voters when he was running in the primaries. And you probably recall there were 14 seasoned Republican politicians who went to maintain the turf of the politicians in terms of making sure this outsider did not get in, and Donald Trump sat down every last one of them. I have not heard anyone make the claim that the Russians would have interfered in the Republican Party primary. Have you heard that excuse? I guess they waited until the general election. They weren't concerned about Donald Trump getting the nomination in the Republican Party, so they waited until the general election, and they wanted to get Hillary Clinton in there, and they did not want Donald Trump to be president because he was, or I should say, they wanted Donald Trump in there, did not want Hillary Clinton in there because they had given her enough money in the Clinton Foundation. So these are the stories that we have to deal with, and I'm going to be talking about the impeachment process since it seems that we are going to be going down this road, and I want us to be aware of how the process works.
Well, I just bring up too, though, during the Obama administration, did he send millions of dollars abroad to try to influence the elections of the Israelis? And it was like common knowledge. And then there's all, how dare another country try to influence our elections? You guys pretty much admitted to doing it for, they do everything, and they turn around. And when somebody else does it or tries to do it, they're like, act like they're shocked and dismayed that attempt was made. I think that's weird, but I don't think the Russians had anything to do with the outcome of this election. I don't.
John, have you heard of? You were talking about the interference in elections around the world by the American government, the CIA, and other institutions operating clandestinely around the world to interfere with elections in all parts of the world. You've heard in the textbooks under the banner of dollar diplomacy. In other words, this idea of what Biden did in terms of bragging about his son working for the government in Ukraine in a job for which he was thoroughly unqualified. The man did not have any experience as far as working in the field of energy. And here's Biden before the Committee of Foreign Relations bragging about how he called up the president of Ukraine and told them that that was his son and that they would in fact call off this investigation of how this man is making $50,000 a month, which he did that for 5 years, by the way, and he was making, what would that be, $3 million plus over a 5-year period of time. When they were investigating how that happened, since the guy did not have any experience in the field for which he was in fact hired, Biden has been bragging, and he's on tape, bragging about how he called up the president and told him to called the dogs off and told him that he did not have a whole lot of time to do it because they were closing in on Biden's son, and he wanted the investigation stopped. He called up the president of the country and told him that you got 6 hours to do it, and if you don't do it, there won't be this $1 billion of aid then funneled into the government that has been okayed by the Congress, because all purse issues started, as you know, in the House of Representatives under Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. So even though that's in the public square, you would think that comment has never been made, and there's no record of it on video, as a matter of fact, or what Biden has been bragging about and was claiming that he had interfered in the investigation, had the person, as a matter of fact, that was Attorney General over there fired, and nobody seems to be interested in that. But we'll talk about that. We're going to get to the impeachment because I want to explain again what the process looks like, because I think we have to really understand what's being said here. And I wrote an article, by the way, on Facebook, which was the studio's posting of that. I'm not on my own site anymore because I got banned by Facebook. But I'm now writing back on the wall through the backdoor approach. I'm doing it from allpointstv.com, and specifically the page called What's Going On, the name of this program here. But I want us to understand the process because it looks like we're going down this road, and I think the American people are going to have to pay strict attention to what's going on here, because what is really happening is that they're trying to change the electoral outcome of what you decided, the American people decided in 2016. We went to the polls November the 8th. Nobody pushed us there. And when we got there, nobody took our hand and made us punch the name or write in the name of the candidate of our choice. We made those decisions ourselves, independent of any outside force. And 63 million people went to the polls, and they voted in the outsider because they're sick and tired of the insiders. And that's the only way you can explain this in terms of how it was that Donald Trump ran against 16 other candidates in the primary. 14 of them were seasoned politicians who had won elective office before. Some were governors, some were senators, had been senators. All of them had held some national office before. And Donald Trump, who never had been elected to a single public office. As a businessman, he was doing things in the private sphere, but came down the elevator June 16th, I think it was, 2015, and came down the escalator of Trump Tower and announced he's going to be a candidate for President of the United States. And of course, everybody was laughing about his possibilities of him being president. And Barack Obama was saying that I just don't believe that he, Donald Trump, will be president. And Donald Trump took that as a challenge and worked harder than Hillary Clinton and came out from nowhere and won the top CEO prize in the country, and looks like he's in for a second term the way things are going right now. And I don't see anyone out there that's going to be able to stop him. And that's why we are now looking at the impeachment process as another stumbling block put out there in his path, because they understand that Donald Trump is a formidable force. And they're trying to stop him by hook or by crook. And the impeachment process is the last stopgap attempt to do that. They've tried everything else, and none of it has worked. He's not going to quit. He's not going to stand down. And so now they are sharpening the axes and sharpening their knives in order to go after this man to stab him in the back, so to speak, because they understand that Donald Trump has not only done what he said he was going to do, but the American people, by and large, endorse what this man is doing on behalf of the nation. And they understand the threat, by the way, of what these politicians and both parties pose to this country. These people are dangerous. And they're dangerous in both parties, but the most dangerous party right now is a party that's trying to suborn the things from which the grounding points from which this nation was in fact launched by the framers, and they're trying to change that. And so Donald Trump, standing in the opposite party, not that they're anything either, but standing in the opposite party from what they're doing over there in the Democratic Party, is the standard bearer that the American people understand that they have to go with. No matter how they may feel about him personally, they've got to go with Donald Trump because of the danger posed by the Democratic Party that really should be running for an election in Moscow.
See, that's the big difference between the left and the right, though. The right will say, they'll admit that they have issues with the person. The left, almost, they transfer this religious zeal onto a political sphere. And they make that their person they put in power, their God. It's almost like a form of idolatry, in my opinion. And they will not admit to flaws, errors, or personal defects. They will not admit to it because it's like they are so blinded. And the thing is, that just goes to show you the intent. They want to win at all costs, regardless, even if doing so, they're going to abandon the position they say they're defending or they're striving for. They're chaotic. They're chaotic.
John, the politicians are the problem. They're well disguised all over the world, but they are the problems on the planet. Everywhere you go, and I've been in 18 countries now in Africa, and several of them in Europe, and I have interrogated the people wherever I go, trying to find out what the status of the politicians are in those various countries. And I will tell you that everywhere I go, I get the same report. And their report is that the political class is running these countries despite the will of the people in those countries, and you can see it everywhere you go. You can look at it. You can look at it with Brexit in England, for example. They voted Brexit 3 years ago, and Theresa May got in there, and she was trying to stall in terms of carrying out the will and verdict of the people in Britain. And Boris Johnson is another renegade politician in there. And go and look at Macron in France and look at the rest of them. I was in Gambia in West Africa, and the people voted Jammeh out. Yahya, he likes to be called Your Excellency first. Your Excellency El Hajj Yahya Jammeh. And they voted him out in 2017, and he decided that the election was not authentic, although who's going to be able to steal an election when he's president? And he claims that the vote was somehow miscalculated, and he didn't lose after all, and therefore he was not leaving. And he wasn't going to leave until the AU, the African Unity Organization, put tanks on the main streets to kind of surround the capital of Gambia, which is Banjul, and put him on notice that he had lost and that he had to, in fact, vacate the office, or they were coming into Gambia. So they waited him out and so on and so forth. He eventually decided that he had to leave and went down here with his other maniac years, where he's hiding out right now in Equatorial Guinea with another politician who's nothing but a maniac. And that's what you see on the planet. And that's what you see in history also. Go read Vonet's book called Ruins of Empire. The French writer named Constantine Francis Vonet. And read the important book he put out in the 18th century as he was going back to look at the ruins of all these empires that had been outstanding in their time in history. You can name those empires, right? You know about them in terms of ancient times. The Assyrian Empire in the 17th century before the Common Era. The Assyrian Empire in the 7th century before the Common Era. The Hyksos Empire for 100 years in the 17th century before the Common Era. Look at the Persian Empire, 525, the 6th century BC. Look at the Greek Empire, starting with Alexander the Great. And you'll see the same thing. Every one of those empires, the Roman Empire, every one of those empires have been collapsed from within. And they were collapsed from within from the same source, which shows you how clever they are in concealing what role they played in history everywhere. And you have to go back and look at it from the beginning go back to Egypt and then come up to the present time period. And you'll see that they have been the instruments of the collapse of every country they've been over. And there are no exceptions to it. And they're collapsing here as well. So now they want to bring out the knives to sharpen them because they have an outsider in the hen house, and that's a threat to them.
See, nobody really seems to understand that in the United States, we had this real elite crew that created this country, founded it. Even though they're aristocrats, or the anti-aristocrats themselves, because they understood being amongst themselves, people like themselves. They understood their foibles and their faults and their shortcomings and what they were. They were admitting to it because they're implementing a government that was actually eliminating the possibilities for abuse. And we have a romantic version in this country. Like we look over to across the pond and look at the royal family, and we romanticize this dynasties. They were nothing more than thugs who got other thugs to work for them, to take other people and enslave them. And then for a reward, the bigger thug gave the smaller thugs that worked for him a reward. That's what the kings and all these knights and all that stuff was about, and all these little princes about. And they don't seem to realize American people have lost sight because we have not taught the current generations that these people we fought against, and when George III, basically kissed him goodbye. That was a major. That was almost like a major rift in the world's way of doing things. They just don't understand the importance of that.
Yeah, John, we really, if you look at how they're doing it right now, they really do not talk about the framers and they're coming together in Philadelphia and drawing up the Constitution. And when they do talk about it, which is very rarely in public schools today, because they have the teachers teaching the test, and to make sure the test is not testing anything on James Madison and the founders of the Constitution. You don't learn anything about how they met in Philadelphia for almost three months, 8 days short of 3 months, starting June the 15th until June 25th to September 17th, 8 days short of 3 months. And they met there in Philadelphia. But you'd be hard pressed to find a class now in public schools that talk about what they did in that room in Philadelphia, how they were in there wrestling with these ideas of how not to make the mistakes that have been made in history, the mistakes that Vonnet and others were writing about. And they were aware, by the way, of Vonnet's work, because these were scholars in that room. And they were determined, first of all, to go back and look at what had happened in the past, and then to draw up a formula through which they would try to concretize, meaning put a barrier between the people running government and doing what they had done throughout history in terms of undermining the countries over which they were entrusted, quote unquote, to lead. the contradiction, as they recognized, was that the paradox is that you have to you set government up to stop the bully. But in stopping the bully, the problem and paradox is that then you have established a legal arm that imitates the bully, who is in fact operating under the color of the laws that the bully himself is making. And that's why they're in that room. And they're in that room trying to figure out how to chain down those who run governments. That was their task. And they did it in secret because if people had recognized what they were doing in that room, they may not have ever had a chance to create this experiment. That's what Franklin was saying when he was asked a question, what are y'all doing in that room? All this secrecy, why is all that secrecy taking place? And Franklin told them what they were doing. They were in that room creating a republic. And he said, according to the book called A Patriot's History of America, or A Patriot's History of American History, Franklin answered and said, a republic, if you can keep it. Because he's aware of how these politicians had come to the forum in every country, and no matter what the restraints were, broke from underneath those restraints. Go back and look at that in history. Look at the violation, for example, in terms of the history leading up to Charles I in England, the second of the Stuart kings. James I being the first of the Stuart kings, right, between 1603 to 1625. And then after James I, Charles I came in. From 1625, they forced him to agree to the Petition of Rights in 1628, 3 years into him running the country like the madman he was. And then given the violations of that, and then also not recognizing earlier mandates put in place, such as the Magna Carta in 1215, after the noblemen rose up at Runnymede. There was the Magna Carta put in place in 1215, all that being violated. And they then realized the only way they're going to get rid of this tyranny brought to the bear by Charles I was to, in fact, put him on trial. And he was not put on trial. What they did is they beheaded him in 1649. They're not going to be talking about that. What they're going to be, what they're talking about, this nonsense about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, that's why they got Lincoln up there as the greatest president. This man was so great, right? He was totally, he wanted to rent his garments over slavery, because this man just was so much about egalitarian principles that he wanted to, in fact, get the slaves off those plantations, and was willing to commit people on the battlefield where you had people fighting against their own countrymen, their own brothers, their own family members. Because Lincoln wanted, according to the folklore, to get rid of slavery. Not that he was a madman, which is what he was, but you can use Lincoln's image in order to teach this mockery of history in terms of politicians being statesmen and they want to do the right thing and so on and so forth. I remember reading what they asked Thomas Jefferson, which person do you think would be the one that could run the government in a way in which we would in fact have our liberties protected? And Jefferson's answer was, ask me not about men, but ask me about how we chain down those who run the government. That's what they were doing in that room. Chaining down those who would, in fact, wield power in the United States. Okay, we're coming up on a break here. Okay, fine. We'll be taking a break, 4 minutes, with allpointstv.com leaving for, well, we'll be leaving WFOV for 4 minutes, and they'll be back here on the other side of the break. We're looking forward to you coming back in 4 minutes. We will, of course, continue what we're doing here. And what I'm getting at is, if we're waiting for the politicians to change their spots, leopards can't change their spots. And leopards are in our government. Hyenas too. Vultures, parasites, ticks, fleas, bloodsuckers. That's who's running these governments. And they're all over the world. And that's what they're doing all over the world. That's not just me talking either. That's what history says. When you read Vonet's book, you'll see that I'm only quoting those who've done the work outside the box, who wrote about these things. And there's only one conclusion they came up with. Vonet, on page, of course, there's different version of his book, Ruins of Empire. But go read page 66 of his book, in the earlier version of his book, where he interrogates himself. He's talking to the person he called the genius. He says, "Oh, genius, what do these ruins mean?" He's looking at all these ruins of all these empires. And the genius answers, meaning his alter ego, answers and says that they all came to their end because of the same cause. How do you explain it? Because the same mindset was in place in all these empires. And what mindset is that? The one that Ayn Rand is talking about in a book called The New Intellectual. She's talking about who they really are from behind their mask, Attila. And I said that one of the programs on radio, and this guy that's from my college, I have a lot of respect for him and like him as a person, very nice person. But when I said that, he said Attila, because his idea of these politicians is that they're statesmen. I wish somebody would tell me which ones he's talking about. He's certainly not talking about the one from the 5th district over here that I live in, Dan Kildee. Dan Kildee is just another political hack. And I want him to know that I'm aware of him just like I am the rest of them. That's all you have in Washington. They can use that stuff about Democrats and Republicans all they want. There are no Democrats in the Democratic Party, and there are no Republicans in the Republican Party. That's just a disguise they put on in order to fool the people and believe they're talking about statesmen. They're not statesmen. They're mafia members. They're part of a mob. And the mob has two different arms. One group calls themselves a liberal group. Another group calls themselves a conservative group. And neither one of them are honest, because if the latter was a conservative group, the first thing you have to conserve is the Constitution. And neither group believes in it. Neither group stands by it, and neither group maintains it, and both groups have, in fact, dismissed it. That's not just George Moss talking. That is, in fact, what Napolitano is talking about in his book called It Is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong, or The Constitution in Exile, another one of his books. Okay, I want to welcome back, thank you for coming back, WFOV, those listeners there, and we are not too far from where we were when you left. I'm still ranting here about the fact that we don't have anything going on here differently in this country at this present time than what has happened throughout history. We're not different here. The politicians are the same here as they are all in all other parts of the world. In fact, in some ways, they're worse here because they have more play money to not only interfere in the lives of the people who live here in this country, but also interfering all over the world. Then they have the nerve to talk about there was some Russian interference, which they made up out of whole cloth, as if people are not supposed to interfere in these elections, but they're interfering in elections all over the world. Such hypocrites. I'll come back to that. I want to talk about that at the end of the program, in terms of the impeachment, because they are going to, unless something comes up dramatic that we have not seen yet, they do plan to go forward with this impeachment, and they don't have no choice in the matter, as Al Green said, the representative from Texas, who said that they have to impeach Donald Trump, because if they do not impeach Donald Trump, then the people are going to the polls in 2020 to reelect him as president. And isn't that interesting? That here's a person in the House of Representatives saying that if they do not impeach Donald Trump, then the people will exercise their democratic privilege, their democratic right to vote for the candidate of their choice. He fears them doing that. Therefore, coming from behind his mask, he says they're going to impeach Donald Trump. Not that there is anything that Donald Trump has done to bring that result about. And I'll talk about that also, because we have to understand what impeachment actually is. And I will get to that later on. Let me go back to what I want to talk about at the very beginning of the program, and we'll come back to that point later on. What I wanted to do was, first of all, I wanted to make sure that I cleaned up my discussion I had last week, based upon my having gone to Africa for 3 weeks. And I wanted to continue to read something that was said to Professor Gates at Harvard University, who went over to Africa in 2000, somewhere around that time period, and did his 6-part series called Wonders of the African World, which appeared on PBS in 2000. And I wanted to read something that Gates reported in his book called Wonders of the African World on page 208, where Gates makes this comment. He's quoting Akosha Purby, the professor that is at the University of Ghana, at Legon, University of Ghana at Legon, Legon. And he's quoting what she says about slavery. Here's what page 208 reads in part. Forts, meaning slave forts such as Almena, were built on land leased to European powers by powerful African rulers. And in these parts, the power belonged to the Ashanti. To know the origins of the slave trade, she advised me quietly, meaning Akosha Purby is advising Gates. She's saying to him quietly, one must know the Ashanti. Why? Because at this time, the Ashanti are the ones who are in control of the slave trade. The slave trade, the African slave trade. And as far as the Ashanti were concerned, they were not selling their brothers or sisters into slavery. They were selling strangers, foreigners, enemies, and captives. The concept of the quote-unquote African was invented by European colonials. Now, this is Purby talking. But I read before the same idea in Mazuri's book. See, Gates did his piece in the year 2000. 14 years earlier on PBS, the late Professor Ali Mazuri did his series called The Africans, which appeared on PBS in 1986. And here's what he says in the chapter called Africa's Identity, the Western Aftermath. One of the great ironies, Professor Mazuri says, one of the great ironies of modern African history is that it took European colonialism to inform Africans that they were Africans. So you take that, come back to what Purby is saying, and you're reading it through another lens now. To know the origin of the slave trade, Professor Coach Purby says, is to know the Ashanti. And as far as they were concerned, she added, and Ashanti herself, they were not selling their brothers or sisters into slavery. They were selling strangers, foreigners, enemies, and captives. The concept of the quote-unquote African was invented by European colonials. She agrees with Professor Purby. Now, I brought this book to the studio, a different book, by a European Africanist, Besser Davison. And he's the one that wrote the book called, originally it was titled African Mother, changed later on to The African Slave Trade. Let me read page 27 of this book. It's not on that page. I'm going to be very embarrassed, but I don't think I'll be embarrassed. Here's what it says on page 27. It's under the heading, by the way, if you want to follow this and go and get your copy of the book. It's under the heading, The Old States of Africa. Besser Davison says, one outstanding fact about the old states of Black Africa, well understood in earlier times, but afterwards forgotten, is that they were seldom or never conquered from the outside the continent. They, meaning the persons that will later on be called Africans, they resisted invasion. They remain inviolate. Only here and there along the coast could European men at arms gain foothold even when they tried to win more. The Arabo-Berber states, meaning the Arab-Berber states of northern Africa, had little luck with their own overland invasion of the south and were in the end frustrated and forced to withdraw. Writers of the colonial period were prone to explain this fact of successful African resistance by reference to the climate and the mosquito. And Besser Davison says, certainly malaria and the sun were grim discouragers of foreign invasion, yet the early records indicate another and more persuasive safeguard against conquest. They point to the striking power of African armies. They show that it was the military factor, time and again, which proved decisive. You can see why he put the title of his book after calling it African Mother. calling it later on the African slave trade, because this slave trade is not driven by Europe. It's driven by those who have not been told that they're Africans. Because before they became that, based upon the European gaze of seeing them all as one group, they were ethnically distinct. And as I said on radio this past weekend, that the European gaze is not any different from those that say that all blacks look alike. And that is the gaze I'm talking about in terms of seeing them as one polity. But that does not mean that's how Africa saw itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing is too. In the 70s, when I heard about the people they're wearing the clothing that was inappropriate for what their ancestor would have, they were buying into this, basically the same view that all of Africa was the same homogenous people.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like prevalent with all the TV, the pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I think that's come through. They think they got this outrage about how Africans are treated, but they don't understand a lot of their biggest enemies were people within the continent itself, not from the outside. Yeah, they just don't see that.
Yeah, it is a imposition that Mazuri is talking about. It's an imposition in terms of how the idea of Africa being one polity is imposed from the outside. And a lot of people have fallen into that trap. I was mentioning before in one of our other programs that Marcus Garvey made that mistake, calling himself the provisional president of Africa. You can say that on the outside of Africa, but it has no resonance inside of the continent itself, because if you say you are the provisional president of Africa, it assumes that there's just one polity. And no person in Africa would accept that. I can tell you that from experience and listening to the Africans, the so-called, the Africans in every country I've been in. I've asked that question. I've asked them also, do you accept the term African American? I've asked that question in 18 countries. And I have not gotten any one, I don't mean it's been absolute in every case, but I'm talking about in terms of the quantity of the ones that are answering it on one side and then the other. I've gotten very few persons, almost none, that would in fact go along with this idea of African American, because you're claiming the whole continent, and Africa is too diverse for that. Umar Johnson is a case in point. Today he called himself the Prince of Pan-African, the Prince of Pan-Africanism. He won't say that in Africa, because if you say that in Africa, they won't understand what you're talking about, because in Africa, there is no Prince of Pan-Africanism. Because Pan-Africanism means that everybody looks at themselves as part of the entire continent, and they don't even do that in any of the 54 countries in Africa. In Nigeria, the problem there is getting the Yoruba and the Igbo and other groups to look at themselves even as Nigerians. That's a problem inside the countries. Or go look in what happened in Rwanda in 1994 with the Tutsis and the Hutus, who failed to see themselves as Rwandans, because if they had seen themselves as Rwandans, they would not have been having a conflict where they're fighting a civil war between these two groups. And you're talking about expanding the idea on the continent, you can't even get that kind of unity of outlook, of identity, inside of a single country in Africa. I was saying this past Saturday. Nobody's going to come against it and say otherwise. They might say it, but they can't say it to me, because I know the facts. I said on radio this past Saturday that when Jomo Kenyatta got the independence of the country that Obama's father's from, which is Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta in '64 became the first president of Kenya. But being Kikuyu, meaning he was part of the largest group in Kenya, he knew that he had to recognize the second largest group in Kenya, the Lu. And therefore, he took Daniel Arap Moi, who is Lu, and made him the vice president. Because otherwise, there would have been a problem with that. Because the two groups would have been vying, because it looks like the Kikuyu were trying to, in fact, lord over the other ethnic groups, and it would have been the problem, particularly with the second largest group there, which was the Lu. And therefore, he understood you could not claim a Kikuyu nationality for Kenya, and you still can't. I don't know if Obama understands that, but that would be a problem, and it still is a problem. I'm an Igbo chief in Nigeria, in the southeastern part of Nigeria. There's no residents in the west where the Yoruba are. If I go over there to the western part of Nigeria, where the Yoruba, that is Wolo Soyinka's group, if I go over there and I'm wearing an outfit, or I have my the little it's like a fan that you have when you're an Igbo chief, and there's some other things you can carry around. Everybody would recognize that has something to do with the ceremonial claims made by the Igbo. However, it has no residence if you go into places where the Igbo are not. Or you can go to Ghana. All the people I see them over here wearing the kente cloth. And they're wearing the kente cloth as if they are part of the group that wear the kente cloth, as if that's all of Africa. It's not all of Africa, it's the Ashanti. And no person that is Yoruba and no person is Igbo. I'm Igbo. I mean, by ceremony. No Igbo will wear the kente cloth. If I wore the kente cloth in the southeastern part of Nigeria, they probably will take they probably will take back the things they gave me to identify myself as an Igbo chief. I have some things in my home right now that identify me as an Igbo chief. If I wore that kente cloth in a wherry where I was inducted, they would think I've lost my mind because I was not inducted as Ashanti. That's why this idea of one Africa is an absurdity. And Umar Johnson can say these things over here. He cannot say that in Africa. It would not be recognized in Africa. You cannot say you are the prince of Pan-Africanism. Nobody would understand what that means. And the only ones that will talk about that are the ones who are the intellectuals, and they don't believe it. You can go read, I could give you a lot of documents about that. You can go read the book by Haki Madhubuti and read that in his book, where some of these person went over there thinking they're going to take the Pan-African idea, which is born outside of Africa, and carry it back to Africa at what was really the Sixth Pan-African Conference. The first 5 being held outside of Africa. In fact, all 5 of the first 5 of the Sixth Pan-African Conference were held in Europe. Explain that to me. But the Sixth Pan-African Conference was held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 1974. And so the Africanists, the black nationalists, the ones that call themselves Pan-Africanists, going to carry the idea to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Their idea was, we're going to go here and we're going to represent the Pan-African idea. And they got over there and found out that they were the only ones talking about it. Why? Because the rest of them had a land space that they now were identifying with. I'll tell you a very good book to read. Go read the book by Shana Balangmayan. called Garvey, Lumumba, and Malcolm, meaning Malcolm X. And she says in the subtitle, All Black National Separatists. And then read the dialogue in that book that went on back and forth between Lumumba in 1960 and 1961, between Lumumba of the Congo and Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first president in the independent Ghana, formerly called the Gold Coast, before 1957. And read about what Lumumba was saying to Kwame Nkrumah, because Nkrumah used to be out there in the bush with Lumumba. But now he is, in fact, the president of Ghana, a head of state in Accra. Lumumba is still in the bush, fighting against the Belgians. And he's writing to Nkrumah, expecting that Nkrumah to show up and not the one that was now the head of the state, got his own space now. And he's writing him saying, look, the troops down here from the UN, including your own troops, they are interfering with what I'm trying to do in the Congo. And he could not understand why Nkrumah did not act the way he was acting when he didn't have his own country. But that's the problem, you see. If you don't have a country, you can go over there and talk the idea of the whole continent, but not when you're there representing a country. And that's what they found out. I'm talking about James Turner from Cornell University, Monica Ringo over there hiding out in the university in California. I'm talking about Malefi Asante, the person that created the idea of Afrocentricity. All these people that were talking this Pan-African talk, I'll tell you where they're not going to talk it. In Africa, where you see the diversity, they're not going to say it over there. And if they did, they're going to be speaking to a very small group because nobody's going to understand it. That does not resonate. And what I'm reading here in these books is exactly what it is, what happened in African history, and the idea that there is a single Africa, that is a European idea, not an idea born out of the continent of Africa itself. And I brought the documents to prove that. Adam Missouri's book called The African, Bassett Davidson's book called The African Slave Trade, and Akosha Purby teaching a lesson to Professor Gates at Harvard University, who wrote the book, came back here in a wonder, and he talked, and he wrote, and the name of his book is Wonders of the African World, because Gates was in wonderment about what it was, because he didn't know. Man, still lightweight. Gates didn't know anything about this. And I told him so when I saw him in Ann Arbor. You can see, you can talk a lot of things to those that don't know. I know. And they know I know. That's why they don't challenge me on those posts. I wish they would get out there. I got something for them tomorrow in part 2 that I'm doing on Facebook right now. They better not get out there. And what I'll be doing tomorrow is this second part of what I want to talk about, and that is the impeachment process, which none of these persons that are out here talking, these scholars understand. And that includes this guy over here at Harvard University, this other guy at Harvard University, Lawrence Tribe, who is a political hack, H-A-C-K, a political hack posing as a scholar. Lawrence Tribe claims to be a constitutional scholar. And he's over here talking about the impeachment process. He's talking about that, he said last week that the phone call that Trump had with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, he said that it reeks of impeachable offenses. It's full of impeachable offenses based upon the phone call. Well, you know what? He doesn't expect you to read it. I read it. And Lawrence Tribe, let me tell you directly, because I'm talking to you. I'm not talking past you. I'm talking directly to you. You're a liar, and the truth is not in you. And I dare you, and the rest of you con artists, because that's what you are. You got 1 minute. There's no such thing as an impeachable offense. Because in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, I'll read it real quickly. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5, it says this right here. The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment. There is nothing listed in that provision that talks about impeachable offenses. Why? Because all it takes is a majority vote of the House of Representatives. In fact, it doesn't state what's an impeachable offense because it's a political process and not a legal process. You can impeach the president by getting a majority vote in the House. And this idea of an impeachable offense, which is what Lawrence Tribe said, is that he's out here just kind of, fooling the public, because if he doesn't know any better, he's not a scholar. And then if he does know and he's saying that there's such a thing as an impeachable offense, then he is in fact a liar. And I think it's a combination of the latter and some parts of the former, because he's not that bright anyway. They're going to try to impeach this president because they cannot defeat this president. And we're going to be watching everything you do out there, because we are on what you're doing, and you're trying to undo an election that was held in this country in 2016, and we're not going to tolerate it. Okay, got to get out of here. We'll be back next week. I want you to always follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.